Constantinople, 476 AD. The last Roman emperor in the West, a boy named Romulus Augustus, sits in his throne room. He is 16 years old. Outside, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer is negotiating the terms of his surrender. But this is not a military defeat. The Roman legions did not lose their final battle. They simply stopped showing up. The reason is so mundane it barely makes the history books. The empire ran out of money to pay them. 3 months of back wages. That is what collapsed the most powerful political entity the ancient world had ever seen. We are taught that Rome fell to barbarians, to moral decay, to the weight of its own corruption. That is the romantic version. The accounting version is simpler and far more terrifying. Rome did not fall. It went bankrupt. And bankruptcy, as any forensic historian will tell you, does not happen in a single battle. It happens across centuries, one debased coin at a time. Let me take you back to the ledger. Rome in the 1st century AD was the world's reserve currency. The silver denarius circulated from the cold moors of Britain to the spice markets of Alexandria. A merchant could travel 3,000 miles and use the same coin. The denarius under Augustus contained 98% silver. You could bite it, weigh it, melt it down. The metal was there. That consistency was not a luxury. It was the infrastructure that held the entire imperial economy together. Roads moved the legions, but currency moved everything else. Contracts, taxes, wages, trade. Every transaction in the largest economic zone humanity had ever created depended on the assumption that a denarius today would be worth a denarius tomorrow. That assumption was about to be destroyed. The empire at its height was a machine of almost unimaginable scale. 1 million square miles of territory. 50 million people under a single government. The legions numbered over 300,000 men, deployed across frontiers that stretched from the Rhine to the Euphrates. Grain fleets crossed the Mediterranean in coordinated convoys. Aqueducts delivered water to cities of 500,000 people. The Colosseum held 50,000 spectators. This was not just power. This was logistical mastery. And logistics, as anyone who has ever run a supply chain will tell you, is just another word for money. Everything Rome did, every road it built, every garrison it maintained, every senator it bribed, cost silver. And Rome had gotten very, very good at spending silver. But beneath the marble and the triumphal arches, the foundation was rotting. Rome's expansion had peaked under Trajan in 117 AD. After that, there were no more wealthy kingdoms to conquer. No more Egypt to loot. The empire stopped growing, but the costs did not stop. The army still needed to be paid. The borders still needed to be defended. The mob in Rome still expected bread and circuses. The revenue from conquest dried up. The empire now had to sustain itself on taxes from territories it already controlled. And here is where the trap closed. Rome had built an economic model that required continuous expansion. Without new conquests, the ledger began to tilt. Emperor Nero stood in the imperial mint in 64 AD, staring at the problem every ruler eventually faces. He needed money. Rome had just burned. The Great Fire had destroyed half the city. Reconstruction costs were staggering. The military demanded their bonuses. The senators expected their subsidies. Raising taxes was political suicide. Cutting spending meant losing the loyalty of the legions. So Nero reached for the one solution that seemed to cost nothing. He ordered the mint to reduce the silver content of the denarius from 98% to 93%. Melt down the old coins. Add a little copper. Mint new ones at the same face value. Instant profit. The dilution was subtle. The coins looked identical. The emperor's face was still stamped on the front. The weight was almost the same. Most Romans never noticed. But the money changers noticed. The merchants who handled thousands of coins every week noticed. And crucially, the Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine noticed. They began refusing the new coins in trade. They wanted the old ones, the heavy ones, the ones that rang pure when you dropped them on stone. They understood something that would take Roman citizens another 2 centuries to fully grasp. Not all money is equal, and once you start debasing, you can never stop. Every emperor who followed Nero faced the same fiscal pressure. Wars in Dacia, revolts in Judea, plagues sweeping through the eastern provinces. Each crisis demanded money the treasury did not have. And each emperor reached for the same solution. A little less silver, a little more copper. The face value stays the same. The problem is kicked down the road. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, The denarius was 80% silver. By Septimius Severus in 200 AD, it was 50%. The descent was gradual enough that no single generation felt the full shock. But the math was accumulating in the background like interest on an unpaid debt. Here is the sinister genius of monetary debasement. It creates a time lag between the crime and the consequence. When Nero debased the currency in 64 AD, prices did not immediately double. The adjustment took years, sometimes decades. Merchants slowly raised prices. Workers slowly demanded higher wages. The inflation crept through the economy like water seeping through a foundation. By the time people understood what had happened, the emperor who caused it was long dead. The policy was politically irresistible because the benefits were immediate and the costs were distant. Every emperor could tell himself his debasement was a minor adjustment, a necessary evil, a one-time solution. Collectively, they were hollowing out the empire's monetary system from the inside. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. A modius of wheat, roughly 15 kilograms, cost half a denarius in Rome during the 1st century AD. By 270 AD, that same modius cost 200 denarii. That is 400 times more expensive. Wages did not keep pace. A Roman laborer in the 3rd century was paid in coins that bought a fraction of what his grandfather's wages had bought. His income had not changed. His purchasing power had been obliterated. This was not inflation caused by supply shocks or external trade disruptions. This was inflation manufactured by the state through deliberate debasement of the currency. Then the 3rd century arrived, and everything accelerated. The year 235 AD marks the beginning of what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Over the next 50 years, more than 50 men claimed the title of emperor. Most were generals proclaimed by their own legions. Most were murdered by those same legions when a richer rival appeared with a bigger accession bonus. The average reign lasted 2 years. Some emperors ruled for less than 3 months. This was not political instability. This was a bidding war for military loyalty, financed by the destruction of the currency. Every new emperor faced an impossible equation. He needed to pay the legions an accession bonus the moment he took power. Without it, the soldiers would proclaim someone else. But the treasury was empty. The solution was always the same. Debase the coinage. Mint more coins with less silver. Pay the troops. The silver content of the denarius collapsed from 50% to 5% in a single generation. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s, the coins were bronze cores dipped in a silver wash. The wash wore off within weeks. Soldiers were being paid in what was essentially painted metal. The effects were catastrophic. Prices in some regions rose by 1,000% in a single generation. The grain supply to Rome, which had functioned for 3 centuries, began to fail. Not because of drought or invasion, but because Egyptian farmers refused to accept payment in debased currency. They wanted gold or they wanted barter. The denarius, the coin that had unified the Mediterranean economy for 300 years, stopped being trusted. Merchants began refusing it. Provincial governors began minting their own coins. The monetary system fragmented. And when the money fails, everything built on top of it collapses. Let me give you the mechanical breakdown of what happens when a reserve currency dies. First, the hoarding begins. Roman citizens who understood what was happening stopped spending their old, high silver coins. They spent the debased new ones and hid the good ones under their floors. Gresham's law in action. Bad money drives out good. The older coins disappeared from circulation entirely. They were too valuable to spend. By the 260s, a denarius from the reign of Augustus, nearly pure silver, was worth 50 times its face value compared to a contemporary coin. The official currency and the real currency had completely diverged. Second, the trade network shattered. Rome's economy depended on long-distance commerce. Grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, tin from Britain. These goods moved across thousands of miles because merchants trusted they would be paid in stable currency. When that trust evaporated, the trade routes went dark. Why would an Egyptian grain merchant accept payment in coins that would be worth half as much by the time he returned home? He would not. The great merchant fleets that had connected the empire began to shrink. Cities that depended on imports began to starve. The urban population of Rome, which had peaked at over 1 million, fell to less than 500,000 by the early 4th century. People fled to the countryside where food could be grown directly. Third, the military began to disintegrate. Roman soldiers were professional troops paid in cash. Their wages were denominated in denarii. When the denarius lost 98% of its silver content, their wages became worthless. Legions began demanding payment in gold. When the emperors could not provide it, the legions stopped following orders. They foraged. They looted. They extorted. Some units simply dissolved. Others proclaimed their own commanders as rival emperors and marched on Rome to seize the treasury. The army that had built the empire became the force tearing it apart, not because of foreign enemies, but because of insolvency. Now let me show you what survived. This is the forensic record. 3 categories of assets preserved wealth through 2 centuries of monetary collapse. Everything else went to zero. First on the list is productive land under direct control, not financial exposure to agriculture, not shares in a farming collective. Actual dirt you owned and could work. When the denarius became worthless, food became the unit of value. The landowner who could grow wheat and olives on his own estate did not need the currency to function. He could feed his workers directly. He could trade his surplus locally. The collapse of long-distance trade did not destroy him. It made him more valuable. The large estates in Gaul and North Africa, the latifundia, survived the 3rd century crisis intact. Many of them transitioned seamlessly into the feudal manners of the early Middle Ages. Same land, same families, different political structure. The asset that mattered was food production capacity. Second, physical gold and old silver coins held outside the banking system. Not accounts denominated in precious metals. Not treasury bonds promising future payment. Physical metal you could touch. The Roman elite understood this instinctively. They hoarded gold aurei and early high-purity denarii. They buried them in jars. They sewed them into clothing. When the empire collapsed in the West in 476 AD, those hoards were still there. Archaeologists find them regularly. Coins minted under Augustus, hidden in the 5th century, preserved for 1,600 years. The people who held physical metal measured their wealth in something that did not depend on the government's promises. The people who held treasury obligations or wage contracts denominated in debased denarii watched their wealth evaporate. The barbarian tribes understood this better than most Romans. Germanic mercenaries serving in the Roman army in the 4th century refused payment in debased currency. They demanded gold solidi, or they demanded land. The emperors, desperate for troops, agreed. This was not cultural preference. This was financial literacy. The barbarians had watched Rome debase its currency for 2 centuries. They knew exactly what a government promise was worth. Nothing. They wanted assets that could not be printed. Third, practical skills and local community networks. When the imperial trade system collapsed, people were thrown back on what existed within walking distance. The blacksmith, the miller, the physician, the stonemason. These were people whose value was immediate and could not be inflated away. A physician's skill in setting a broken bone did not depend on the silver content of the denarius. A miller's ability to grind grain had real value regardless of what the emperor in Rome was doing to the currency. The regions that maintained stability through the 3rd century crisis were those with strong local economies that could function independently of the imperial monetary system. Egypt, parts of North Africa, and some of the eastern provinces maintained trade and production because they shifted to barter and local currencies. They stopped waiting for Rome to fix itself. Now let me show you what failed completely. Cash savings held in denarii. The math is devastating. A Roman merchant in 150 AD with 10,000 denarii in savings held coins that were 75% silver. Real wealth. Generational wealth. That same merchant's grandson in 270 AD, holding the exact same number of coins, held bronze tokens with a silver surface coating. The face value was identical. The purchasing power had been destroyed. 10,000 denarii in 150 AD could buy a large house in Rome. 10,000 denarii in 270 AD could buy a week's worth of bread. This was not market volatility. This was state-sponsored theft conducted through monetary policy over multiple generations. Urban businesses dependent on the imperial trade network collapsed. The great port cities, Ostia, Carthage, Alexandria, depended on long-distance commerce. When the currency failed and the roads became dangerous, trade volumes fell by as much as 90% in some regions. The merchant class, which had thrived for 3 centuries, was wiped out in 2 generations. The cities depopulated. The forums emptied. Rome itself, the capital of the world, became a shadow. By the 5th century, Cattle grazed in the forum. The population that remained survived by scavenging building materials from abandoned structures. The economic infrastructure that had sustained 1 million people had evaporated. Every financial promise denominated in debased currency became worthless. Pension contracts for retired soldiers. Bonds issued by provincial governments. Debt obligations between merchants. All of these were written in denarii. The government continued to honor them at face value. But face value meant nothing. A pension that promised 100 denarii per month in 200 AD was still paying 100 denarii per month in 270 AD. But those 100 denarii now bought 5% of what they had 70 years earlier. The legal obligation was fulfilled. The real value was gone. This is how governments default without officially defaulting. They pay you back in currency that has been destroyed. The smoking gun moment comes in 301 AD. The Emperor Diocletian, attempting to stop the inflationary spiral, issues the edict on maximum prices. It is one of the most desperate documents in Roman history. The edict lists over 1,000 goods and services and sets maximum legal prices for each. A pound of pork, 20 denarii. A haircut, 2 denarii. A primary school teacher's wages, 50 denarii per student per month. The penalties for violating the edict were death. Diocletian was attempting to legislate away inflation caused by 2 centuries of monetary debasement. It failed within months. Merchants stopped selling goods rather than sell at a loss. Black markets exploded. The edict was quietly abandoned. You cannot fix a destroyed currency with price controls. The damage was structural. A year later, Diocletian introduced a true reform. The gold solidus, struck at a fixed weight of 72 coins per Roman pound, never debased. It became the state's trusted standard. But it did not replace the failing denarius. Instead, the 2 currencies circulated side by side. Taxes were collected in solidi. The army was paid in solidi. The denarius remained in public hands, steadily losing value until it disappeared. Rome had engineered a 2-tier system, sound money for the state and military, depreciating money for everyone else. It was presented as reform, but it was really containment. The Western Roman Empire formally ended in 476 AD when Odoacer removed Romulus Augustus. But the true collapse had happened long before. By the 3rd century, Rome was already economically insolvent. The state survived on administrative momentum and military force, extracting taxes while its monetary foundation eroded. Currency debasement hollowed out trust, trade networks weakened, and the integrated economy that once dominated the Mediterranean dissolved. What fell in 476 was not a thriving empire, but an empty shell. In the aftermath, Western provinces fragmented, urban populations shrank, infrastructure decayed, and trade contracted for centuries. Recovery took generations because trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire endured. By maintaining the integrity of the gold solidus, Byzantium preserved monetary credibility, trade stability, and institutional continuity for nearly 1,000 years. Rome's decline was not simply about invasions or moral decay. It was insolvency financed through debased money. Short-term fiscal relief created long-term destruction. Assets tied to the currency collapsed. Tangible assets and productive land endured. The lesson is stark. When monetary discipline fails, economic structures eventually follow. Political forms may linger, but without sound money, sovereignty becomes an illusion sustained only by borrowed time.